Subcommittee of the Education Committee, and the subcommittee is dealing with governance and accountability. This is the third meeting that we have had on this topic, and we know that California's K-12 system faces unprecedented challenges, and our persistent achievement gap is reflected by a disparity between successful students who are often white or Asian and financially well off, and struggling students who are too poor, often too poor, Hispanic, African American, or disabled. Today, the subcommittee will explore various approaches to better align the state, regional, and local agencies to address student needs and improve performance. Reforming our complex education governance structure alone is not a silver bullet solution, but such changes are fundamental to closing the achievement gap. Today's presenters will provide different perspectives on the achievement gap and recommendations to streamline our three-tiered governance structure. I know that my fellow senators, Romero and Weiland, are someplace close by, and hopefully they will join us. But first off the bat, on the agenda today is our state superintendent, Jack O'Connell. In 2008, Superintendent O'Connell organized the P16 Council to provide recommendations on what the state can do differently to assist local education agencies in closing the achievement gap. And we're really pleased to have you today to brief us on efforts to assist counties, districts, and schools to help all children achieve academic success. Superintendent O'Connell, you have a presentation?
We do, and I'll get to it in about a minute and a half.
Okay.
But thank you very much for the invitation to be here. A critical issue for us, and I appreciate your help, your colleagues, and the legislature on helping us work on legislation to craft thoughtful, deliberative strategies to help close and address the achievement gap. I often say I believe this is the single most important issue facing us, not just in education, but really in our society. And I know that you're aware of a national report that came out a little over a year ago that said if we could eliminate the achievement gap, all of our budgets would have surpluses, both the state, the country, and all of our states. The achievement gap, as you know, Senator, is real, it's stark, it's persistent, and absolutely must be addressed. We no longer have just a moral imperative to close the achievement gap, no longer simply a social imperative. Today it really is an economic imperative, and again I would reference the earlier national study. When you look at the data and when you extrapolate the data and you do the research, it's really very clear, it's glaring, that students of color, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, students who are here learning the English language, and our special ed kids continue to lag behind their white and Asian peers academically. That said, we know that all students can learn, and we know that all students can learn to very high levels, and that's critical for us. We often talk about the subgroups as well, and I just referenced some of those categories, but it's important to note that not all of our students fit neatly into every single subgroup. And a lot of us, have an image of exactly what every single subgroup looks like. And regrettably, it's not quite that simple. So I would stipulate early on with a word of caution that we know there are exceptions within those subgroups. They don't all fit neatly into our boxes. I'll give you just two quick examples. We have a growing number of students, African American, from Somalia, who are here learning the English language. And we tend not to think about that. And yet that is an important, developing, emerging subgroup for us. Another example would be on perhaps the other side of our academic scale. So many of our students that we categorize as our Asian students come from countries that do not perform as well and bring unique challenges. Students from Vietnam, students from Cambodia, students from Laos. And those too are on the rise, and they bring challenges. In fact, some in that community even call it a reverse achievement gap, because some of those students do not do as well as some of their, what we normally think of as stereotypical Asian peers from Japan or maybe other countries like that. I belong to a state association. All 50 states have a state superintendent. And we were in Arizona, well, recently, and this story's about a year ago, and I wasn't sure if I was going to tell it last night when I was looking at my notes, but I think I will. And one of my colleagues from a Midwestern state was saying, California drives the public policy, and we do. When my colleagues say, "Jack, is it true we're teaching algebra in 8th grade?" I say yes, and they all then prepare, for their standards, and they know the textbooks are going to come out. And when we were looking at the NAEP scores a year ago, California was in the bottom third, the top of the bottom third. And so my friend from the Midwest was actually going to kid around and say, "O'Connell, here you guys are driving the policy. Why is it that California is lagging behind the rest?" And I'll quote him. He said, "Is it because you're somewhat diverse as a student population?" I said, "Yes, we are." And he said, "Could you give me the snapshot picture?" And I said, "I think I can. 48% of our kids are Latino, 31% are white, 8% are Asian American, and 8% are African American." I said, "Here's where it gets really interesting. Over half of our kids that come to school every day qualify for our free and reduced meal program. Almost 40% of our kids that come to school go home and speak a language other than English. 39% of our kindergarten kids came to school today to learn an English language. K through 12, it's 1 out of 4 kids came to learn an English language. And slightly over 10% of our kids are designated special education. And as you know, we have over 100 languages spoken at several of our school districts as well. So I brought just a couple of slides that, and this might just be really for perspective and leading up to the achievement gap. You can see a dramatic increase in the. Do you have a reverse screen? I guess you don't.
I don't have a reverse. I'll move out of the way.
Apologize for that. But we'll just fly through this. This will be a minute and a half. You'll see the dramatic increase in the enrollment that we have. The number of students. Now, it's been relatively flat the last several years in California, but you can see the dramatic increase over the last 30 years, which obviously has put pressure on our entire education system, and I don't have to tell you about the budgets. The next slide that we have will show you the special education, and I would attribute this to better diagnostic tools that our schools have. So not just the number of students, but look at the increase in percentage. And I would expect that's going to continue to increase. Our English language learner population. There's no other state that comes close. And this is the figure I say 1 out of 4 students K through 12. And in kindergarten this year, 39% of our kids come to school to learn an English language. This is only going to continue to increase. And when you look at other states, no other state is even close in terms of percentage of students whose parents don't speak English. So they go home from school and speak their native language to speak to their parents. And, of course, I don't have to remind you that our tests are given in English. And then this is dramatic. And given the economy, it's for 2009, I haven't seen the data, but I guarantee it's going to be north of 51% students who are eligible for free and reduced meals. And this is setting up where we are academically. When you look at our CSTs, students scoring proficient or advanced for ELA, this is all of our students, 7 years ago, 35%. You can see we're clearly trending in the right direction. This is really something I think cause for celebration, to today have 50% of all of our students, grades 2 through 11, where the test is administered, to be proficient or above. The next one is math, and it's similar. It's 35%, and then it'll be 46%. So again, we're clearly trending right direction for math. The next one, this is the slide I call all boats are rising. If you were, when we began this a decade ago, if you were a 6, I think we use a figure 630, you would be in decile 6. That's not bad. But if you stayed flat, the exact same as your school, 630, you would be a decile 1, not where you want to be. So this is a slide I call all boats are rising. Now, the last two, here's your achievement gap. And this is where we have not been successful, haven't been nearly as successful as we want to be. This is for our African-American students. The top chart shows that in 2003, a 31-point difference for ELA between our white students and African-American students. And this last year, we saw the 1% drop. That had been 31 across the board to 2008 until this last year. For math, it's a similar story. That had been 28% difference across the board until this last year. So we've seen a 1% narrowing But that's insufficient. I mean, it'll take 30 years before we eliminate that, and that's what we have to work on. And then the last slide we brought is for the even larger student population, and this would be for English language arts for our Latino students. And the good news here is we actually saw a 2% drop between 2008 and 2009, narrowing. That had been 33% across the board until this last year. And then for math, last year was actually 23%. So we saw a 1% drop from 24 to 23 till year 2008, and then we saw another 2% drop this last year. Yeah. So that concludes our slide presentation, if that's okay. 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, I decided that I wanted to really try to focus on closing the achievement gap. That would be a contribution that we could make and make collaboratively. So I had established my statewide P16 Council, P for preschool, 16 as you referenced, through College University. It really is an amazing collection of individuals. It's chaired by Barry Munitz, mutual friend of both of us. And we have about 50 people, every segment of education, as well as business community, labor, foundation, philanthropic community. It's really a very dedicated, serious group. They issued a report. And I'm kind of critical in education that we have a lot of reports, and they get put on the shelf, and they become dust collectors or doorstops. This report, this is the model you want to use, and I've heard other people tell me this, that this is a report actually being implemented. We came up with 14 recommendations. All 14 within the next couple of months will be implemented. Majority already are, and we're working on the implementation for most. The group came up with an acronym. I think they came up with an easy acronym so I could remember it, and it's ACES. And ACES stands for Access, Culture, Climate, Expectations, and Strategies. And then it pretty much, they developed subcommittees for each of those four. And then they came up with recommendations in terms of how we can address the achievement gap contained within these areas. So access, for example, they came to the conclusion preschool might be the most cost-effective way we can narrow the achievement gap. We know that there's not just an achievement gap, there's a readiness gap. Right. I mean, there have been studies by Rand and others I know you're familiar with. I've heard you talk about it, with the readiness gap, even before kids show up to school the first day of kindergarten. So preschool is important. So they recommended a couple of legislative vehicles be introduced 2 years ago, one by Assemblyman Jones, one by some guy named Steinberg. And both of those passed, and pleas were signed by the governor, and I know the committee supported both. And they were designed to a couple of different things, but it was basically designed to help the preschool community do a better job of providing quality and accessible preschool. They also said we need to do a better job of utilizing data. I kind of laughed with the race to the top, which we were not successful with last week, when it's one of the priorities for Secretary Duncan is better utilization of data. Well, our P16 Council a couple of years ago said we need to do a better job of utilizing data to improve instructional materials. And so we actually now have teacher professional development that's available, that's actually in practice for the utilization of data. And again, legislation that was passed that the governor signed that you supported as well. So that's the A for access for ACES. Right. Yep. The C's for culture and climate. Culture and climate. We did a survey of both students and a survey of staff, and it was very interesting. When we asked the questions surrounding achievement gap issues, are there impediments that could be ethnically oriented that might prevent students from succeeding? Majority of the teachers said no. Majority of the students said yes. So that tells you right there that we have a problem, really a breakdown. So the survey has helped us. So we have today, we're in the process, and this has been difficult to do, but we have some of the best minds on this issue developing a framework for developing culturally relevant professional development data that will be available for all of our school personnel. Tell you another recommendation. Sounds kind of simple, but it's one that I could implement unilaterally. You're familiar, you have many California distinguished schools in your area. The recommendation from our committee 2 years ago was do not recognize a school as a California distinguished school unless they are narrowing the achievement gap.
Achievement
And so that's something I could do and did 2 years ago. We put all the schools on notice. If you want to be a California Distinguished School, you need not apply unless you're focused and you're closing your achievement gap. And candidly, last year, we had fewer schools eligible than we had ever had before. I think some didn't think we were serious. Some realized it's a major challenge, but now they're really, really working on it. We also know that we have to have partnerships. And so we have toolkits that are very practical in terms of how we can engage other community partners, the faith-based community, the business community, local organizations, CBOs, community-based organizations, private, public organizations, in terms of how we can address and meet the needs of the whole child. We knew that middle schools really hadn't received the type of attention they need. And so one of the recommendations was, let's develop really a cutting-edge based professional development in the area of middle school. So we initiated what we call Taking Center Stage Act 2, which is a web-based portal that's been up and running now for about 18 months. And we've had hits on it from every other state and other countries. And it's best practices, strategies. Some of it's how to teach. Some of it's how to create that learning environment in your middle school to improve middle school instruction. And then finally, when you get to the ACEs, the S on strategies, we're putting together, and we believe we'll have this completed in the fall, what we call our brokers of expertise. And what brokers is going to do is really highlight best practices. If you're a school or a teacher that's really meeting the needs, closing the achievement gap with a particular strategy, maybe it's a strategy, you have a unique way to reach English language learners in algebra or in English language acquisition. We want to really come into your classroom and videotape your lesson, and then allow other teachers in the privacy of their own homes, maybe the night before they're going to be teaching algebra to ELA students, you'll be able to then learn from that. So brokers is something that's very exciting. We received a generous grant, and we're well on our way to implementing that. I know that a lot more needs to be done than simply this report, but this report has been a blueprint, and it will, in fact, be totally implemented by this fall. We also know that our recommendations are not the end-all. We have to remain focused. It's been more of a challenge given the budget situations that our school districts are facing. But I have to say the legislature's been extremely supportive. The governor's been very supportive. The State Board of Education's been very supportive. And there was some role that they had to play, and they did 100%, to allow some districts to collaborate, such as Long Beach and Fresno.
Right.
And that's a pilot program I know you're going to hear about. But as you know, and I've heard you say, all students really do deserve a shot at success. Success in school, success in their career, and success in life as well. So I want to thank you for inviting me. I looked at your agenda. It's very impressive. Thank you for inviting Rick Miller. Rick Miller's deputy superintendent, and he's really taken the leadership role for us, has done some of his own research, has read everything on this topic, and has really been a walking encyclopedia. And he really single-handedly has helped us coordinate our efforts at the department so that all of us, including myself, now look at issues through a lens. How will this issue address, impact, and hopefully close the achievement gaps for our students? I know you'll appreciate his insight, as well as I looked at the agenda. It's very, very impressive. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Superintendent. So your P16 council is still going on.
Correct.
And the recommendations, you say most of them have been implemented
Correct.
Successfully. And what time period do you see the rollout in terms of change of behavior of, the closure of this achievement gap? I mean, and I know it takes a long time to, be successful with this, but is there a time frame that you're, working against?
Based on current trajectory, we would close the achievement gap in 30 years, and that's unacceptable.
Right.
And we must accelerate that closure. But when you look at the past 30 years, it had really been status quo. So it really is a culture change, and it's a culture change for us here in Sacramento as well as in the field. So that culture change has led towards a true belief that all students can learn to very high levels, and now we have to make sure the system itself treats all of our students, fairly, and gives all of our students that legitimate shot.
What obstacles have you found, or have there been facing the recommendations from the council? It seems like the governor's supportive, the legislature's supportive, et cetera. Is there any other obstacles that you might have, faced along the way? Or maybe I'll just change it a little differently, because this is a governance discussion in relation. So, is there anything in the system, the state system of governance, that has prohibited you from being successful at your job?
I wish I could give you one single sentence. There's no silver bullet. There's no overnight solution. Obviously, resources are critical, and I get big picture on that. For a lot of our students, I like to talk about the 3 R's in education: the rigor, the relevance, and relationships. And I've come to the conclusion the most important R is the last one, the relationships. And when you have 40, 45 kids in the classroom, it's hard to develop that type of relationship that's really necessary. And so, obviously making the budgetary decisions and trying to protect education to the extent possible. But there's no one single, the philosophy that all students can learn to very high levels, critical. Making sure that we have well-qualified teachers, good leaders in our more challenging schools. How can we devise an incentivized system to have that occur? When you look at some of our more challenging schools and then look at the staff, they tend to be your first, second, probationary teachers, a larger number of teachers without a credential, that type of temporary. And that's not healthy. A revolving door with principals in some of these schools as well. So, we're trying to work on that. There are multiple programs. We ought to try to consolidate some of those with the federal government. Right. There are several lists out, even today, in terms of the most challenging schools that we have, that different people come up with. And it becomes a capacity issue for us. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughts and for your presentation. We'll certainly have a continuing conversation with you.
Thank you for the topic. You're right on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Next panel is I'd like to introduce Professor Doug Miller, Sarah Ryan, Jose Espinoza, and Robert Ream, education policy researchers from the University of California, Riverside. This is a Riverside team. Professor Mitchell and his team have conducted substantial research on organizational strategies to address the achievement gap. And they'll be sharing today with us some observations and recommendations. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you. Dr. Mitchell?
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for having us, and thank you for providing this opportunity for us to share our thoughts about how governance and organizational reform might take place. I'm going to concentrate my remarks on sort of the principles of organizational reform rather than specific recommendations, as I think you'll hear a lot about those from my colleagues.
Okay. Hang on for a second. I'm going to close the door here.
Sure. I also want to thank you for your continued support of the University of California, because without support for the university, none of the four of us would have anything to say here. We're all the beneficiaries of our participation in the university, and it's been important to all of us.
Thank you.
I want to just begin with just a couple of remarks about background. The nation and our state in particular have been engaged in what can be described as a continuous crash program to reform public education for just about half a century now. Since the Brown decisions, the Sputnik launching, and the New York teacher strike, the schools have faced a dramatic change in the perception that it's not just resource allocation, it's not just providing, there's something seriously wrong that needs to be addressed, and nothing is more seriously wrong than the achievement gap that Jack O'Connell's already described and put some numbers to. And I'm going to try to rehearse the half century, but it is important to recognize that over the half century we have tried an enormous number of different kinds of organizational and policy reforms, and we're still facing a very large, intractable, slightly modified but largely intractable achievement gap problem. And, of course, the current wave of educational reform efforts are focused on the one hand, standards-based, test-based accountability systems aimed at holding adults responsible for performance, and on the other hand, efforts to move educational control away from the traditional education responsible agencies through charter schools or parent choice programs or mayoral takeover of school districts, or possibly even, as your Bill 1186 suggests, moving power substantially into the office of the governor to move policymaking into the regular civic governance and away from the traditionally educator-dominated governance systems. But as we look at this and have tried to review the literature on different kinds of approaches to education policymaking, I see 5 principles that I would call to your attention as possible guidelines for what might constitute the sort of policies that are going to be required if we're going to overcome the achievement gap. And the first is to recognize that in order to succeed in overcoming the achievement gap, we're going to have to find policies that are robust enough to not just reach across schools and annihilate the differences between school averages. We're going to have to reach inside classrooms. 70% of the variance in student achievement is inside the classroom. Only 30% of it is between classrooms and schools. So we're going to have to, with such things as teacher capacity building, motivation, removing distractions and disruptions, producing more equalized facilities, stronger supervision of instruction, and other techniques aimed at reaching inside the operation of the classroom to improve the quality of instruction. Second principle. It's clear that in addressing the issues of equity, which are at the core of the achievement gap, the judicial branch of government has been the leading active agent over the last half century. We've litigated school finance, we've litigated school desegregation, we've litigated the right of special needs children to get services. And my only point in citing the leadership of the judicial branch of government is that I think it's possible for the legislative and executive branches of government to do better than they have over the last half century. Third principle, to pursue excellence, it has become apparent that we have to centralize control over education policy and programs. And that if you look over the last half century, centralization is the dominant theme. The legislature in California has become the major policy guideline setter for the state, and it is important that we recognize that centralization has been moving in recent years to the federal government even, and that this centralization has been seen as the principal vehicle for raising standards and improving the uniformity of access to education. It is controversial, of course, as people are troubled by the centralization of authority. The fourth principle, overcoming the tendency of the status quo to resist and change and perpetuate itself, we have now recognized makes it necessary to reallocate power and authority. That it is changing governance structures that gives new governance authorities the opportunity to act. There's no right government structure. I don't think we've been able to find one that's superior to others. What there is a recognition that when you make governance changes, then you have new actors, fresh commitment, and issues to be addressed in the governance process. So clearly the most profound governance changes in the last several years have involved shedding educator governance controls and replacing it with civic governance controls on the one hand, and citizen rights, parental rights through charter schools and choice programs on the other. Principle 5, accountability relies on broadly accepted and highly reliable measurements of expected outcomes. Without measurement, we don't get any results. And again, if you look at the last half century, when we developed measures of racial isolation, we could concentrate on desegregation. When we developed measures of gender inequality, we could concentrate on that. When we developed finance inequality measures, we could get finance litigation in front of the courts. When we developed standardized achievement tests, even though they're challenged with regard to their reliability, their validity in measuring what we really want measured, nevertheless, it's the availability of reliable standardized achievement tests that enables us to actually measure the achievement gap and focus our attention on fixing it. Or in short, in education reform, you get what you measure, and you don't get what you cannot measure. So the data management, which Jack O'Connell was already mentioning here, is a number one priority, I think, for the legislature, for the state government, is what kind of data, who gets access to it, how quickly can it be made available, how can it be analyzed in such a way that people can make decisions from it. Finally, my principle 6, which is a little bit controversial, I think, but I want to leave you with that. School reform policies based on setting achievement standards and using test data to hold schools and individual teachers accountable has, I think, reached its maximum productivity. That what we are seeing is that the central barriers to further improvement in public education have more to do with teacher capacity than with teacher will, and the accountability system has been focused on the proposition that they didn't have the will to do it. The issue of capacity is now more important than the issue of will, and that we are seeing psychological and physical disengagement by a fairly large slice of the population. Large numbers of high school students are cheating routinely. They're dropping out in unacceptably large numbers. In other words, they are emotionally disengaged from the educational process. So I think the future is going to rest on our finding the people who have the kind of hope that lays behind the success of Barack Obama's run for the presidency, the kind of belief and confidence that we can do better than we have done, and empowering those people and giving them the resources and the support that they need to lead the system. And that we've had too much in the way of efforts to hold people accountable in a narrow and punitive way, and not enough in the way of leadership based on real engagement and making learning exciting again. And with that, I'll stop and turn it over to my colleagues on the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Senator Liu. Thanks for having us today. It's a great opportunity on an important topic. I brought a PowerPoint. I have 5 slides. Am I allowed to load them up and share them with you?
Yeah.
Maybe can you help me with that? I'll start. One aspect of Professor Mitchell's comments that I think is important is this issue that if we want to deal with a problem, we need to be able to measure it. And I've spent a lot of the time in the last 3 or 4 years, as have my colleagues, in trying to measure a particular aspect of the achievement gap problem that pertains to the issue of student mobility. And when I mention student mobility, I'm talking about students who are making non-promotional school change from school A to school B to school C, rather than moving from elementary school to middle school. I'm also not talking about residential mobility, although lots of student mobility is associated with residential mobility. So I want to make 3 points about mobility and ask some questions about how government might be organized differently to deal with the various problems that are created by student transients. And specifically, I'm going to make comments as pertains to mobility among Latinos in California. Part of the reason why is because I had worked formerly with Professor Russ Rumberger at UC Santa Barbara, who directs the Linguistic Minority Research Institute on student mobility issues in California. And so I've spent time thinking about specifically Latinos who, as Superintendent O'Connell mentioned, constitute half of the student body in the K-12 system, and how mobility impacts them in their achievement. First, I just want to mention that, and to present some data here, that school completion rates among California Latinos are unacceptably low. As you can see, this is data developed by the California Dropout Research Project that about 6 out of 10 Latino students who enter the system will complete 12th grade with a diploma. The gaps are very large across racial ethnic groups. Well, what does that have to do with student mobility among Latinos? Well, Latinos are much more mobile than non-Latino whites. The black bar graphs are data across nativity status of Mexican Americans throughout the United States. The differences in those bar graphs between Mexican Americans and non-Latino whites just suggest that rates of mobility are much greater among Latinos. We document Mexican Americans here because they constitute the majority of Latinos both in the United States, the vast majority, and in California. So first, the dropout rate is very high in California for Latinos. Secondly, mobility rates are much higher than they are for whites in the nation and in California. So what does that have to do with the dropout rate? There is strong evidence that students who change high schools even once are less than half as likely as stable students to graduate from high school, even controlling for other background factors. So these high rates of student mobility, particularly among Latinos, are contributing to these high rates of not completing school on time, especially in this state. So student mobility exacerbates school dropout and therefore should be better measured so that mobile students are, accounted for. And then this leads to a couple other questions. I mean, I'm sensitive to the notion of what I don't know, to be more inclined to ask questions than to give answers here. And so, but I do want to make a couple other statements about, why student mobility is occurring in California among Latinos. Because one might say, well, this is associated with residential mobility, and what can we do about that in this housing market? But research shows us that half of the school changes that students make in high school are the result of either schools asking students to transfer out of their school or of students making the changes of their own volition. Another half is related to residential mobility, but half of the school changes we're talking about have to do with things that policymakers might be able to address. I also want to mention that students in California are much more likely than students in other states to be subjected to school-initiated transfers. It's much more likely in this state that you're going to change schools at the secondary level if the school tells you to do so. Thirdly, it's important to understand that most student mobility happens within a district. So the vast majority of kids who change schools non-promotionally are moving from school A to school B within a district rather than crossing district lines or state lines. So that then begs the question, given that mobility rates are high, that they impact dropout rates, that they're mostly localized, well, what should we do in order to improve graduation rates among Latinos as pertains to the student mobility issue? So I'll just end with a series of, thank you, Sarah, a series of questions rather than answers. So, will the state of California measure student mobility and track cohort mobility rates alongside of cohort graduation rates in the coming year? So we're going to track cohort graduation rates in the year to come, as you know, and perhaps it would be easy also to track mobility rates. Because if you don't measure the phenomena, it's hard to fix it. Secondly, by enrolling higher performing students while encouraging academically challenged students to head elsewhere, can schools boost overall test score performance in ways that undermine the accountability system? The question here is, to some degree, is whether the tenets of accountability are undermined by the issue of student mobility. So mobility doesn't only impact dropout rates, it also has a big impact on the validity of our measures of how well teachers are teaching and how well schools are performing as well. Thirdly, if school districts were accountable for the performance of mobile students, could districts then encourage schools to work together to better assist mobile students? The idea here is if most mobility happens within a district, then why not ask districts to be held accountable in supporting schools that have particularly high transience rates? Some schools in LA have 40% turnover each year of their student bodies. It's enormous churning in the urban areas as well, especially. Fourth question. Should schools with high rates of mobility, if we measure them, and we know that they have those high rates of mobility, be encouraged to develop, for example, newcomer clubs, ways of greeting students when they enter the school door in the middle of the school year so that there's not this curriculum incoherence where they're in a classroom in school A, they get to school B, they get placed in the wrong classroom, they don't know where the bathroom is at the elementary school level, whatever. Can we help the transitioning of so many Latino students so that we can reduce dropout rates? And then lastly, and Sarah Ryan will talk more about this point, but should California make a concerted effort to increase the counselor-student ratio and focus especially in increasing the number of bilingual and bilingual counselors in the state that serves 50% Latinos in the K-12 school system? So those are my questions. Sarah? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you again for allowing us to speak before you today. In the conclusion section of our paper, written 2 years ago now, we concluded with several promising strategies for improving the effectiveness and equality of learning within classrooms. These strategies seem all the more critical today. In the text, the word targeted precedes each of these suggestions, and this word is not simply rhetorical. It's included with purpose. Certainly there is a need for greater resources across the entire state in the education system, but high poverty schools serving disproportionate numbers of underrepresented minority students clearly demonstrate a greater need. Without attending to stark inequities in the distribution of resources and thus educational opportunity in our state, we cannot hope to begin to close gaps in achievement and opportunity, which are the purpose of our hearing today. We also assert that targeted attention to the development of human and social capital of students who have fallen behind in academic development is at the heart of educational success for all students. And one critical component of such development is the provision of adequate numbers of highly trained counselors. School counselors, particularly at the junior high and high school levels, have a powerful impact on students' course placements and their long-term educational goals. A number of researchers have concluded that for students in the lowest sectors of socioeconomic status, school counselors are the single most likely source of information about college. School counselors also play a vital role for students making school transfers. School counselors are largely responsible for assisting mobile students during both the departure and arrival ends of the transfer process. Yet in this state, California continues to rank dead last in counselor-to-student ratio, and I say continue as this has been the case for a number of years. Recently released data from the National Center for Educational Statistics shows a rate of 1 to 809, well above the recommended 1 to 250. In June of 2006, in California, the passage of Assembly Bill 1802, the Middle and High School Supplemental Counseling Program, provided approximately $200 million to California school districts, specifically to hire and train school counselors in providing additional services to students scoring far below basic on state standardized tests as 7th graders, and to students who had failed to pass the California High School Exit Examination as 10th or 12th graders. Both of these student groups include disproportionate numbers of poor and minority students. With these additional funds, California school districts were able to hire approximately 3,000 additional school counselors, and in the first year of the program, KC passage rates and high school graduate rates increased, while college applications to the UC and CSU systems were at an all-time high. However, as a stopgap measure in response to recent severe cuts to education spending, districts have now been allowed to use these funds in any way that they see appropriate. Many districts have laid off hundreds of school counselors and are using these funds for other purposes. And in his 2010-2011 budget proposal, the governor is proposing similar change for funds targeted at the Funds for Student Success, a program which supports 3 initiatives aimed at increasing the enrollment and persistence rate of low-income and minority students at the post-secondary level. All 3 of these initiatives include personalized counseling as a vital component. While we suggest the potential benefit of increased spending flexibility in our paper, again, the word targeted seems important. As we wrote, districts and schools with articulated plans for addressing the amelioration of student achievement gaps might be offered greater flexibility in how they spend education monies by linking increased budget flexibility to locally developed and led program innovations. It is understandable that in such dire economic times, districts have to make difficult decisions about how to allocate resources. Nonetheless, spending flexibility, which leads to the diversion of resources from programs and strategies which have proven effective in combating achievement disparities, seems short-sighted and likely to lead to even deeper entrenchment of current inequalities. For these reasons, one specific strategy for addressing gaps in educational achievement and opportunity would be to protect funds targeted for programs which have proven to be effective in generating improved rates of educational achievement and attainment for students caught in these gaps, particularly when the alternative is releasing those funds to be spent on other general expenses which do not achieve the same goals. In conclusion, you may ask, what's the point? These specific recommendations serve to illustrate one example of the many ways in which the state legislature can assume a positive governance role in ameliorating current disparities across groups in achievement. Through advocating for the interests of poor and minority students, state government can effectively support the improved achievement of students whose families often lack the political power to have their voices heard at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you. Jose?
Senator Liu, thank you for the opportunity to address you in the committee this morning. In his remarks, Dr. Mitchell touched on the concept of equality of educational opportunity, and I want to share with you a section written by Samuel S. Coleman and his colleagues in 1966 as part of the Educational Opportunity Report that I think is pertinent to today. This is what he wrote. Schools are successful only insofar as they reduce the dependence of a child's opportunities upon his social origins. We can think of a set of conditional probabilities, the probability of being prepared for a given occupation or for a given college at the end of high school, conditioned upon the child's social origins. The effectiveness of the schools consists in part of making the conditional probabilities less conditional, that is, less dependent upon social origins. Thus, equality of educational opportunity implies not merely equal schools, but equally effective schools whose influence will overcome the differences in starting points of children from different social groups. I will not, spend time unpacking this quote in its entirety this morning, but what Coleman and his colleagues identified has to do with the power that families and community have on achievement. To echo Dr. Mitchell's comments once again, 70% of all variation is found in achievement is found inside of classrooms. Any policy, therefore, designed to reduce the achievement gap must include family and community as part of it. Joyce Epstein, a leading thinker and researcher on school, family, and community partnerships at Johns Hopkins University, has argued for the past 15 years that student learning is influenced by three potentially non-overlapping spheres of influence: the school, the family, and the community. I will share with you a quote from her work. Shared responsibility and overlapping influence mean that parents do not bear the entire burden of figuring out how to become and remain in their children's education across the years of schooling. Involved in their children's education across the years of schooling, Rather, schools share this burden and must create programs and conditions that inform, consult, assist, and involve all families in their children's education and development every year. Also, community groups, agencies, and individuals are not left to operate in geographic or in social isolation. Rather, educators, parents, and members of communities combine to create a coherent system to help all students. Basically, Dr. Epstein is arguing for the development of partnerships between schools, family, and community. In preparing this testimony, I recalled some of the conversations about the achievement gap paper we prepared for the P16 Council, the statewide P16 Council, and we realized early on the importance of family and community in closing the achievement gap. In conclusion, there are three initial steps that California can take to build school, family, and community partnerships to close the achievement gap. One, teacher training programs can have a greater focus on developing competencies to work with parents and community. Two, administrative training programs can also have a greater focus developing these competencies in existing and future school leaders. And three, there are training programs in the state that work with schools, parents, and community. These programs should be continued and developed further. And thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all of you for a very thoughtful presentation. And let me just welcome Senator Lonnie Hancock from the Bay Area. She sits with me on the Education Committee, very concerned about all of our young people. And welcome, Ms. Hancock. Would you like to say a few words or just listening?
I just was fascinated by the topic of this hearing. I've been very concerned about how we close the achievement gap and what concrete things we can do, and also how we might streamline our governance system so that once we've identified those class size, teacher retention, counseling, the factors that would really help us close the achievement gap, we know what we need to do to support our schools directly so that they can get there as we know they want to do and are trying to do.
Thank you. Do you see, what is the role of the state in this? You talk about students, family, community. That's kind of a no-brainer where all of us come from, locally. We all know that intuitively. And yet through the finance mechanisms that the state has gone through the last generation, last 30 years or so, we've allowed the state to determine, to be that partner or that overseer or that person that directs education, and it's not been very successful. So, so what do you have any reaction?
But number one, the state needs to be the keeper of the data. There's no way to get where we want to go without data on how we're trying to get there. And we need that data on a very broad basis, and we need it made available in ways that it can be analyzed, and we need to recruit people like those of us who work at the University of California to provide insightful analysis of this data. But that's number one in my view. Okay. The second is that the state has engaged in the construction of the governance system, which is indeed complicated at the moment. It's complicated because there are very important stakeholders. I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that the organization of teachers has been the largest governance change in the last half century, as the negotiation of contracts have had a tremendous impact on the daily way in which schools do business, and the state structured that governance change. The state has structured the governance change to the creation of charter schools and other forms of parent choice, and the state has a governance structure that has defined the standards toward which we need to be moving. And those are basic state actions, and they have had tremendous impact on the ways in which the schools work.
Thank you. You have a question?
Yeah, I do, actually. In a previous life, I was the regional representative of the Secretary of Education, Dick Riley, in Federal Region 9, and watched the standards movement move from obviously the Association of Governors to the Bush administration, then to the Clinton administration, and then onward. We used to say, or Secretary Riley used to say, evaluate from results, not minutia, implying that there should be a very broad leeway for districts and schools to decide how they were going to achieve certain standards. And I'm interested in following up on what Senator Liu asked. How do you see the division of responsibility between the federal government, the state, districts and schools? And also, as we look at the standards movement and the disparity between the standards of different states, do you think it would be wise to have the national government set a standard, whether it would be NAEP or something else, but leave up to the states more of the ability to decide how to get there?
Well,
There's quite a few questions there. Just, the role of the different entities and then how we deal with standards.
I'm happy to turn to my colleagues, but let me just make a couple of remarks in response to your questions. I think a very appropriate, important question. Globalization of economic reality and political reality has made it necessary for us as a nation to shift the governance of education away from the traditional educational governing agencies and into the hands of the mainstream civic government. Okay, that's reflected in mayoral takeovers in the big city. It's reflected in the effort to create a climate of competition and choice by charter schools or vouchers or other pieces like that. And so this, it seems to me, is not something about which we have that much choice. This is the consequence of the globalization of our economy and of our political realities. At the same time, it seems to me, as I tried to say in the conclusion of my remarks this morning, the standards test-based accountability strategy has had tremendous cost in the imposition of frustration, alienation, and disengagement in the schools, which I view myself to be the more serious problem right now, that we are creating an environment in which the use of data to produce threats of disempowerment and reorganization and dismissal is we've carried that about as far as it can be productive. Okay, I'm not saying it hasn't been productive. I'm just saying we've carried it about as far as we can, and we now are facing very serious problems of disengagement, emotional, psychological, and physical disengagement in the form of dropout, attendance problems, etc. And so I don't know that I've addressed all of your question, but that's sort of where I enter the discussion at the moment. The federal government will have standards. It will not be able at the present time to impose them on the states. It has to allow the states to do it. This will unfold over the next decade or two, in which by the time I'm ready to retire, right, the federal government will have standards that look a lot like California's today, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes. Robert, Dr. Reed.
Well, I was just going to follow up that there's been quite a bit of research on, how do programs get implemented in a way that helps us to reduce, say, the achievement gap? What are the fundamental components of implementation of standards that matter? And as Dr. Mitchell was mentioning, one of those components is will. Mm-hmm. Do teachers in classrooms have the will to employ whatever standards they're being asked to employ? And I think it's right that we're reaching a tipping point here where the law of diminishing returns is sort of kicking in, and maybe will is decreasing as instructors in the classroom have less freedom and creativity to do the things that they know how to do. But the second aspect of whether or not we implement programs that reduce achievement gaps, according to a lot of research, is capacity. And to the degree that we turn our attention toward the development of standards, but not focus on the development of the capacity of people in classrooms to deliver those standards to students, we have a problem. And one specific example of that problem as pertains to the achievement gap is, let's take the gap in achievement in fourth grade mathematics among Latinos in California. It's 28 points on NAEP. It's the biggest gap of any gap in achievement among fourth grade Latino students in the country. California's gap is the largest. We also know that among English language learners in California, only 5% of them have teachers in their classrooms who are credentialed with the bilingual bicultural credential. This is capacity, fundamental capacity. I think there's probably a link between the gap that I just mentioned and this lack of capacity. Right. So capacity and will, as they pertain to what Dr. Mitchell's comments were, I think it is important to think about. We should reinvest in capacity, in my mind.
Okay.
We're saying professional development. Just as an aside, the Civil Rights Division of the San Francisco office of the Department of Education, while I was there, I asked them to find, if they could find schools where any schools where kids, there was not an achievement gap, or where African American and Latino students in particular were on grade level and there wasn't a big achievement gap between them. They found one district, and it was a place where the district required every teacher to have a CLAD certificate. And they said that it actually, if you work with any group of students who may not speak standard college English, and I know that there's been other research indicating that the use of that standard professional English is extremely important, that you need that CLAD certificate. And that would be a capacity issue.
Right.
That we could find you benefit one group of kids and you benefit everybody. But so thank you, for that. That's important. Just a quick check. Your phrasing is very striking. Use of data to threaten has gone about as far as it can be productive. Did you mean for student outcomes or for teacher morale, or what?
I think we have serious problems at both of those levels. I think we have a problem. Well, one of my graduate students was reporting on how they're handling this year's testing program in her school district, right? So they start, right, with a test rally, right? Why? Because of the recognition that students are not motivated to score well on the state test, right? And the teachers, recognizing that the students are not motivated to score well, right, are trying to do things to boost their commitment to it. But the teacher that reports this also reports it with an air of frustration and dismay that 10 days of her school year is taken up trying to build up the capacity to take the test rather than try to learn the material that's supposedly on the test. And so I think we're dealing with that frustration at both levels. It's good data that about 75% of high school students are cheating fairly regularly, right? I mean, and which is a way of saying that they don't identify with what they're supposed to be there for. And, so I think it's at both levels quite serious.
Well, thank you very, very much for this presentation. Lots of food for thought, and we'll probably come back and ask more questions. But thanks very much for joining us today. And our final panel this morning is Long Beach Unified School District Superintendent Christopher Steinhauser and Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction Rick Miller and Helen Duffy, Senior Research Analyst, American Institute of Research. Welcome. So tell us how you're closing the achievement gap successfully.
Good morning, Chairwoman. Thank you so much for our time today, Senator Hancock. We want to talk to you about, and the real expert is sitting to my left. We're going to talk a little bit about a partnership that was started between Long Beach and Fresno, and Chris will speak about that. But I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about structures, which I know is the point of your bill and the point of this conversation. As we entered into our work around the achievement gap and participated in getting down to facts in the Governor's Committee and other studies, we continuously run up against this problem of flexibility and problems of structure and the good intentions from Sacramento and how they actually play out at the local level, and what we need to do to sort of think differently about how we encourage local school districts, especially school districts that have proven successful, to innovate meaningfully in their classrooms and in their districts. And I think it does cause us to think differently about how we set our structures. If you look at our recent recommendations around Race to the Top, and you look at I think there's a good idea there in how to think differently about what each role should play, as you were talking about earlier, Senator Hancock. And specifically, I think the state government needs to think differently about setting that clear bar of what we expect schools to learn, but then providing more tools and best practices and assistance in allowing districts to get there, but giving them more flexibility on how they're going about showing that success. And Chris will talk about the partnership, but the other thing that we found out when we sat down with them, when we looked at offering flexibility, we were often frustrated by, even within the Ed Code, the state board didn't have the authority to grant the flexibility that we really wished we would. And then there are other instances that I think particularly we need to pay attention to, where oftentimes flexibility was available, but most districts simply didn't know it was there or how to use it. And I point that out saying that's a problem, a Sacramento problem. It's not a district problem. Some of our most innovative superintendents, it is very difficult sometimes to figure out where the flexibility is in our system, and you have to make that a full-time job, which we don't really want to ask them to have to develop. And oftentimes I think we find, if rather than sort of tiering things and making things semi-complicated and saying this is how you do it and it's for this limited time or this time, if we just sort of do blanket flexibilities and say you will be able to do these things and we're not going to come check you, then at that point you really open up innovation. And I think that's what we ought to be thinking about, and we ought to be thinking differently about what role the state plays in that structure. So that's the sort of the basic I would begin with, and I think Chris can talk a little bit more importantly about how it happens at the local level.
And thank you, Rick, and thank you, Senator Liu and Senator Hancock, for inviting me to speak here. Superintendent Hansen apologizes for not being here. He had an emergency, and so in light of our partnership, we formed our comments together, so I'm speaking on his behalf, and I promise not to say anything that he would not support. Our partnership serves approximately 160,000 students, approximately 20,000 employees. We're both, Long Beach is the third largest school district in California, and Fresno is the fourth largest. I need to stop here for a minute and publicly thank Rick for his support, Jack O'Connell, the state board, because this, in my opinion, this is my 28th year in the school system, my 8th year as a superintendent. Long Beach is a much better school system because of this partnership, and I think Mike would echo the same about Fresno. So I want to talk about a few things where we would like to see change in governance and support, and also highlight some issues that we've heard about today on outcomes. One is on categorical flexibility. We're very pleased that we have moved into tier flexibility, tier 1, 2, and 3. However, we would both feel strongly that it needs to go even further. We need to have total flexibility of all of our resources so that we can do a better job of serving our students and closing the achievement gap, because the achievement gap is our number one focus in both school systems. The other one, and Rick hit upon it, is the waiver process. We've written several waivers. We've been very fortunate. They've all been approved, but they take about 9 months. That's 9 months of time that my students go without the support that they need, just because of the process, the way it's structured in meeting timelines. And so it's very frustrating for us in the trenches to know that we can do a really great job of serving students. And I'll give you a specific example. We had written a waiver for CASI to use the CASI funds before students even took the CASI, so we know who's going to be in trouble. We took a waiver, and then it became part of the flexibility, which we're very thankful for. But that's why we push for total flexibility with a great deal of accountability, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. The other one is the data. I can't stress enough, and we've heard it through our panels today. We need a robust data system in the state of California where Chris Steinhauser moves from Oakland to San Diego. That superintendent can click on that data and know exactly the strengths and weaknesses of Chris so that we can move on. I'm blessed in Long Beach to have a great data system. Data is alive and well in Long Beach. My kids use data. My teachers use data. My parents have access to all their children's data 24/7. They love it. They want it, and they even want more. We use data in a very productive process, not a punitive process. We believe in continuous improvement. Our students set goals for themselves. We set goals for our schools, and we move from that point forth. We heard about professional development, and I want to hit on that. One of the key partnerships that we have through Long Beach and Fresno, we focus on 3 areas: ELL support to our students, mathematics, and leadership development. Those are our 3 major initiatives. However, I'll be honest with you, our work has spilled over to every aspect of our school systems. In Long Beach Unified, we were fortunate to pilot a program several years ago that we call MAP, M-A-P 2D, which is really focused around Singapore mathematics and how they teach math in Singapore. Huge success. I only have one school in Long Beach Unified at the elementary level that scores below the 50th percentile on the California Standards Test. That program has been exported to Fresno. Fresno has received their largest gains in the last 2 years on their math. But here's an example. The way Mike implemented in Fresno is very different than the way I implemented it in Long Beach, because he learned from my mistakes. and that's the key. He actually moved it much faster. This program has been replicated in Garden Grove, Compton, and Oakland with all the same rates of success. So we're very pleased. AP, we launched open access for AP about 4 years ago. We have a 63% increase of our students taking AP. Mike wanted to do the same initiative, so then we have trained teachers together. Last year we trained about 160 teachers between our two school systems over the summer on how to provide a better program in AP. Next week, Mike has 24 of his middle school principals visiting my middle schools to see what they're doing and how they can replicate those practices. Through the waiver process and through this flexibility, both Mike and I believe strongly that a superintendent must be willing to put his or her head, so to speak, on the chopping block. And with that, we both have data dashboards, and we have set 5-year goals. Our boards have adopted similar initiatives. We call ours the Academic Success and Career Initiative. By 2013, and we know how many kids will be proficient in algebra, 5th grade language arts, and math, and so on. College going rate, for example, our college going rate right now is 74%. 74% of my seniors last year are in college, and we know exactly all 757 colleges that they're at, and I know how many of them are finishing in 4, 5, and 6 years. The other piece that we feel strongly is that there has to be a huge connection on the P16 partnership, and you heard about this today. Right. And that's going to look differently from community to community, but I'm very fortunate in Long Beach to have a great city college, a great state college, and so is Mike. But we feel strongly that if you adopt outcomes, you evaluate the outcomes, you give greater flexibility, greater things will come on. Now, how can the state change? I would say this. I would ask the state set policy, and as we've heard earlier, let the locals decide how to implement it. Hold us accountable to our outcomes. If we don't do well, then come back and let's have a discussion. I'll give you a great example. In Long Beach Unified, we do the same thing. We look at the data of the schools. If you're doing really well and you're above a certain mark, you have total flexibility on what to do. Even though the board has set policy on curriculum, policy on closing the achievement gap, goals for every single school, and those are reported out on a yearly basis. Schools who are not as successful are going to have greater scrutiny by me, and I'll give you an example. I took my 8 PI middle schools and took them out of they were in a cluster of all middle schools, and they're now under my direct supervision. So that's an allowed message through the community. I took 2 of my best principals who had taken middle schools who were not doing well to California Distinguished School status, removed them out of their positions, and provided them as coaches to the principals into these schools. And we have developed one large professional learning community. It is very productive. It didn't take a lot of effort to do that. It just took really one board meeting to do so. But again, differentiating support and flexibility at the local level can be replicated at the state level. Thank you.
How do your parents respond to what's going on, or in what ways? And more importantly, the teachers, how do they respond to this approach?
Well, I'm blessed. I tell everybody I'm the most fortunate person in the entire world to work where I work, because I have a wonderful community in Long Beach, and I know Mike has similar structures. We have teacher councils that meet every other month, and they're at the elementary, middle, and high school level. And so we bring initiatives to them, and I'll give you a great example. A year and a half ago, my elementary teachers said, "Chris, can we raise our social promotion policy, raise the standards on ourselves?" I said, "Go for it." And so they took about 7 months to study a new policy, brought it to the Board of Education over a period of about 5 months, and now I would say that Long Beach has the toughest social promotion policy in the entire state of California. But the teachers developed it, they worked with their parents, they piloted it, and then they bring it back. So we have a lot of transparency going on. We also have parent forums that meet every month. Each one of my levels, SUPs, have their own parent forum, and I have my own parent forum. I meet with about 100 parents every month, and we bring everything to the table to the parents. So when we were rolling out our MAP 2D program, we brought that to our parents. We actually took field trips to visit the classes to see what it looked like. When we rolled out the AP, when we said AP would no longer be a gatekeeper, you didn't have to take all these tests and hoops to get in there, that we designed what's called an AP leadership team of parents and college professors and teachers to decide how can we best serve our students. And they would come to me with issues that I would have to deal with. So, for example, providing a summer bridge program for all students, professional development for teachers. So in Long Beach, we like to do things in a very transparent method, but include a lot of stakeholders. And so in one way, we move slowly, to be honest with you, but we take our time to do it. We don't have a lot of protests at our board meetings. Our board meetings are on the average of an hour in length.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
We are very fortunate, and I'll tell you something right now. Because of the budget crisis,
right.
I had to issue 783 notices, and I can't tell you how many teachers have come up to me and said, Chris, we are not upset with you. We're upset with Sacramento. And we know you are fighting for us. But it's because we're very open and honest about everything we have. We share everybody's budgets with every other school. We try not to have any hidden secrets. So whatever we do, we try to include all stakeholders through the process.
Okay, thank you very much.
And so I just want to let you know, Helen Duffy's here. Because, as Chris said, we recognize that data is one of the most important drivers of our decisions. When the partnership between Long Beach Fresno was formed, we immediately said we need to make sure we're doing research on this from day one. And so AAR has done a great job of sort of documenting what's going on. So she's here to help us answer any questions from the research perspective.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Or I guess, Chris, what would you recommend perhaps would be the 3 top immediate reforms that the state might make in terms of governance of the K-12 system?
Well, one area that I think is, and it's not so much of a governance, but is the support of the data system. Even in these tight fiscal times, we must support our data system because that will support the governance and how we do things in our school system.
So it's not only data for. Is it just data for students?
No, data pre-16. For example, I want to know how many of my students are in what college, how many need remedial support. It has to be and I say preschool, the K-12 and the higher ed, everyone working together because it needs to be accountability and ownership for all folks. The other piece is the CTC. I think the CTC needs to, in my personal opinion, needs to be revisited and revamped. And I'll give you a great example. Right now, if you're an RSP teacher, resource specialist, you have to go and get a special credential. Well, I may have a great teacher who's been teaching literacy for 15 years, but I can't put that individual in that program because he or she doesn't have the right certificate. But I know based on data that teacher is blowing the socks off of everything for those students. That is a huge frustration for individuals like myself. And then the other piece I would say is remove all barriers, i.e. the waiver process. If I had the dream of all dreams, I would abolish the ed code and start over. I know that's not realistic, but because I can't tell you how frustrating it is sometimes to have to look at something and to say, well, that one word needs to come out to change the law. Right. And that's very frustrating because in the trenches, what the teachers, all they want is support to make sure they have the resources they need, and the same with our parents.
Thank you. Are you ready for that, Ms. Hancock? And flexibility. You're talking about flexibility, just allow you to do what you think is best as long as you meet the bar the state sets in terms of where we need to be for our students.
Correct. And we've set a dashboard. And, for example, I've said that by 2013 that 60% of my 8th graders will be in Algebra 1 and with a 75% proficiency rate. And so we are monitoring that every year. Right now I have 40% of my kids in Algebra 1. So you can see we've set a pretty rigorous bar on a timetable. We've set a 90% completion for graduation rate. We've set a 75% for college going rate, which we're almost there. But I think at the same time, that bar should be negotiated on a yearly basis with the policymakers, in this case Sacramento and the local systems, who are willing to do that. I know not all superintendents would be willing to do that, and I'm okay with that. And I'm okay to be fired if I don't do a good job, because it would not serve my students well if I ask for flexibility and then don't put my feet to the fire to make sure the change happens in the trench.
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Liu. I'm assuming that Long Beach, you have a few schools that are in school improvement, but mostly all your schools are over the bar and making annual yearly progress, so that you think that by 2014 you'll have 100% achieving proficiency.
Well, I'm a parent of two children who have gone through my school system, and one graduated from Boston College and one is at San Francisco State. And between the two of them, they took 15 AP classes and did quite well. But I'll tell you right now, they both didn't always score proficient on the CSTs. But you know what? They had great SAT scores, and they did really well in college. So I'm a firm believer that not every single child is going to be proficient, quote unquote, by our standards, but they will be proficient as a productive citizen of our state and our nation. So what I look at is continuous improvement. So I would say, and I with all confidence, that every one of my schools is on a continuous improvement path, and I'm going to be spending a lot more time with some schools more than others. And that's where the documentation from outsiders such as AIR are so important, because we want to know what is working well and what isn't.
This is just a blunt question about your test scores.
Sure.
Because I keep trying to either aggregate or disaggregate the relationship between passing the bars that we have set in our standards program and teaching young people to love learning and go on and become successful in their lives. I have talked with a number of schools that appear to be doing wonderful things. It breaks down when I say, and our test score is improving, or is everybody achieving the state standards goals? And that's why I'm asking you that question.
Well, and I'll give you an example.
Where are you?
Well, we're about 56%. About 50% of my students are proficient on the English Language Arts test, district-wide, and about 52% of my students are proficient in mathematics, or 55, I think. But I do have some schools that are struggling, on those standards. I'll give you an example. One of my toughest middle schools has doubled the amount of proficiency in English language arts in 2 years, but it's far below the AYP that it needs to. It's a school of about 75% English language learners, 100% poverty, and a very high mobility factor. But the staff has stayed there. But it's very hard, but they're committed to making growth, and they could leave if they wanted to, but they don't leave. So it's those types of things that we have to look at differently. So
Yeah, well, that's when we get down to how we align our standards system so that it supports and doesn't do what was referred to in the last panel, the use of data to threaten and make people insecure, which will make a subnumber of them walk away from the game. So I'm very supportive of what you said about total flexibility. But what standard do we use then? Do we use AYP, API, continuous improvement? Makes sense to me, but it's not the rules of the game right now.
Right.
So, and that gets back to the purpose of this hearing,
Right.
which is how do we align our governance so it doesn't get in the way of creative leadership?
We were just talking about this exact issue before we came up here. So I do think that continuous learning is the new name of the game. I think the Obama administration has clearly indicated that they want to see us move in that direction. We are currently working at the Department of Education on a true growth model, student-based growth model. So as you know today, Senator, we have AYP, which is a static bar, and we have API, which is a cohort growth model. It looks at one fourth grade class, the next fourth grade class. We are now developing a model that will actually look at individual student data and say, based on their success rate, what can we expect them to go? And then you have an appropriate model. And I would argue that it's important that we don't, and I don't think Chris would disagree, that the state, we continue to hold the bar of an expectation and a desire for outcomes based on proficiency. Now, we still have that growth, and we allow that growth, and we reward you for making it along that continuum, but we don't back off on the outcome of high expectations for all children.
If you could combine those two things.
And that's exactly what we're working to do.
That's excellent.
If I may add, for example, if you were to give flexibility to a school system or a set of districts, there need to be several metrics, and I'll give you one example. For example, African American students, especially males, that's our biggest achievement gap problem that we have in this nation, to be very honest with you. So one thing that for example, I did in my own school system, because I have the access to the data at my computer, I told every single principal that I was going to download every single African American student in their school system, their schools, and to make sure that those students were placed in the appropriate programs. Well, you better believe that when the superintendent says that he or she is going to do X, and I follow up with that school, every single one of those students was placed in the appropriate program. So I did not want to hear that Chris Steinhauser wasn't placed in the GATE program because he's a behavior problem. I don't care about his behavior. We can work on that a different day. But it's that monitoring, whatever we monitor does take place.
It does. Okay. All right. That's great.
I do have another question.
One more question, Ms. Hancock.
How do you see the role of student supports? Was just suggested by your answer. Chris Steinhauer has a behavior problem. Maybe he needs some family therapy. Maybe he needs to eat breakfast. Maybe he needs a number of things. And how do you see that alignment of the supports that may make better learning possible?
I'll give you an example of what we did in Long Beach because of the fiscal crisis. We took our social workers and we took our counselors and we actually reallocated them in a different manner. So we looked at student data. We actually looked at schools that had where the students had the greatest number of absences and truancies. Then we divided the system into 4 quadrants and reallocated those individuals to those quadrants. And it's been a very successful program because they're making home calls, they're visiting these kids, and they're actually saving lives on a daily basis. That was totally different than the old model of just giving people a quota, telling them to do it within their system. And we did a total K-12 alignment. Elementary, middle, and high schools are grouped together as clusters. So, and it wasn't the principal at that school deciding how to allocate those resources. It's a team in the central office on coordinating student services. And then we report the outcomes on a monthly basis to our Board of Education.
How long has your partnership been in existence?
Formally, 2 years?
2 years.
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah, it's actually been wonderful. Our boards are very supportive of it. And I can't tell you, our folks talk daily. Mike and I don't even know who talks, which is the goal of the partnership, because they're writing assessments together, they're planning, developing curriculum together. We both can communicate through a program called Telepresence. It's a Cisco device where teachers and staff can be 400 miles away and in the same room and write assessments together and plan together. It's very powerful.
And did you face any obstacles, the two of you? The two of you wanted to do this together, and going back to your respective schools, did you face any obstacles at schools?
Absolutely no obstacles, and because of Rick's great support, we were able to put this thing on the fast track. The boards of education in both school systems have been totally supportive. They've communicated with one another. It's actually been very good. But you have to have people willing to work together.
Right.
But I will say that there's, and I appreciate that, but we did not give them the flexibility that they originally sought, wanted, or frankly need. So there still remains some serious barriers from a state perspective that we're not able to legally get them what they need, and so there's work to be done there.
And so you've identified those for us?
We can provide that too, because we have a list of what he gave us and what we could not do. So
And there's actually, Senator Lowenthal is authoring a bill 1369. So
that's great.
And I would also argue too, and Helen can talk about what they found in the research of the barriers and what's worked and what has not. But the way this partnership was actually put together was Chris and Mike, and actually I was there having dinner together. And I think I can't say enough about the need for collaboration, right? So the need for, and there's a place for the state to play a role in bringing people together. If they had not had dinner that night, then had not had a process, and that was frankly a foundation-funded event. That thank goodness we had that foundation to do that for us. But that's the role the state ought to be thinking about playing.
Thank you, Helen. Would you like to add to the conversation about data?
Sure. So I'm here. We've been documenting the partnership for the last 12 or 14 months, and in the course of our work, what we've done is meet with key leaders in the district, shadow some of their activities, attend meetings, and that sort of thing. And I brought with me today the first in a series of briefs that we're going to be producing as a result of the documentation work that we're doing. That I put some out on the front table. I have some here for you.
Great.
But I think it's very early in this process to really walk away with concrete lessons learned. What we've done is really document the early stages of this. I think it's too early for us to say what is particular about these two districts that allows them to benefit as they have from this partnership. But it's clear to us that attention to data in both districts is a very key part of their work together. A commitment to continuous improvement is key to this. And the establishment of what we've called a common framework. It's really the areas that Chris identified as really being the focal areas of their work, which is mathematics, English learners, and leadership development. So those three areas and an agreement that they're going to really dig into those three areas seems to be a really successful part of the partnership. So
That's great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I appreciate your participation, and I look forward to hearing more about what's going on as Ms. Hancock and I will be around for a little longer then. And also that you take a look, have an opportunity to take a look at a bill that I introduced at 1186 and that would try to realign and clarify the system of the State Board of Education. It's more pertinent for what you're going through, and also the Superintendent of Schools and the Secretary of Education. And so I look forward to having more conversation with you, all the panelists that participated today. And I really thank you for your time and effort on behalf of the students in California. Thanks. Is there any public comment? Anybody would like to come forward and share your thoughts?
Good morning, Senator Matt Regan with the Bay Area Council.
Yes.
We are a business-sponsored public policy and advocacy organization, and we were in New Jersey this time last year together in the snow. I don't profess to be an expert on school governance. All I can say is from what I know, Ruth Goldberg would be proud. But I do know a little bit about the achievement gap. And as you know as well, the achievement gap is by and large a product of a school readiness gap. So as you move forward with this work and dig deeper, we would urge that the whole preschool world be a part of the conversation. As the federal government moves towards competitive funding and race for the top type language, we all know that races are only fair if all the kids start at the same place. So we have produced a study, and many others have done the same, that clearly show that the achievement gap begins before kindergarten, and as the child progresses through the educational system and grows, that achievement gap grows with the child and becomes a lot more expensive to close. So we would urge that if you want to fix the achievement gap, the best way to do it, and perhaps the most economically proficient way to do it, is to make sure it doesn't happen in the first place. So we would urge greater funding, greater support for, and perhaps as we move forward with a greater governance conversation, roll the whole pre-K world into the K-12 world in some way, shape, or form to make sure that the child's progression through the education system is as seamless as possible.
Thank you very much. And we're doing that, working on that. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much for joining us today.